Beneath the pavement of Midtown Manhattan, a forgotten 9-foot wide tunnel has been stagnating for years. Originally conceived as a luxurious link for the Gilded Age commuter, this corridor once served as an artery for thousands of shoppers to transition seamlessly from the rail platforms of Penn Station directly into the basement of one of New York City's flagship department stores. Though, as you can now see, what was once hailed as the gateway to, quote, the Cathedral of Commerce has now devolved into a space far less appealing, and apparently not even the recent $100 million restoration process was enough to redeem the space. So what's the story behind this bizarre tunnel under Manhattan? Why would it cost 9 figures to restore, and what exactly remains down there anyways? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover New York's most notorious abandoned pedestrian tunnel. This is the story of Gimbels Passage. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. In 1910, the intersection of 33rd and 6th was the front line of a retail war. You see, the Gimbel brothers, led by the ambitious Bernard Gimbel, had arrived from Philadelphia with a singular mission: to dethrone R.H. Macy Company as the king of Herald Square. And this is where it gets interesting, as their weapon of choice was not just a massive full-scale department store, but a masterpiece of urban integration, for this was to be a sprawling retail titan designed to dominate the consumer landscape in a very literal way. It's important to note here that this was the so-called Beautiful City era, a period when New York was shedding its gritty, industrial skin in favor for neoclassical grandeur. So, astonishingly, to design their space, the Gimbels hired none other than Daniel Burnham, the visionary behind not only the 1893 Chicago's World Fair architecture, but the master plan of Chicago itself. Now, although we've already discussed his accomplishments as an architect at length on many occasions throughout the years, I'd like to showcase just a few of his most legendary works so that you'll understand the overall impact that he had on American culture. For starters, he designed the Flatiron Building, which is perhaps one of the most recognizable silhouettes in New York. He envisioned the monumental gateway to the nation's capital, Union Station, in Washington, D.C. Not to mention he did the Rookery Building in Chicago, which is the oldest high-rise in the city, blending heavy masonry with a revolutionary light-filled interior court. And beyond that, the list goes on. Hence, Burnham, perhaps more than anyone else, understood that in a vertical city, the most valuable real estate wasn't just the sidewalk, but also what was beneath it. With that in mind, there was also a synergy at hand, as the Gimbels' new location was to be built nearly simultaneously with the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, now called PATH, a rail network which ultimately would be connected to the massive Pennsylvania Station. These factors led Burnham to a brilliant realization, be it somewhat obvious, that thousands of commuters arriving from New Jersey and Long Island could become a captive audience. Though to do this, they'd need to construct a private pedestrian passage beneath 33rd Street. And if they pulled it off, the Gimbels could effectively intercept thousands of travelers. In other words, the tunnel's origin was rooted in a symbolic marriage of transit and trade. However, getting a private tunnel approved beneath a public city street was to be a monumental feat. You see, there was an issue. Under the trust doctrine, New York City holds all the land beneath its streets in a public trust for transit and utilities. In other words, the Gimbels didn't own the land beneath 33rd Street. They only held the rights for their abutting property. Now, to bridge the gap, the Gimbels had to petition the New York City Board of Estimate and Apportionment, and they did so by successfully lobbying the city by framing their private shopping shortcut as a critical piece of public infrastructure, further arguing that the tunnel would act as a safety valve, siphoning thousands of pedestrians away from the already over-congested sidewalks on 33rd. Some sources also speculate that the brothers helped make their perspective more compelling to the council via, let's say, unofficial generosity towards the decision makers, but again, that's just speculation. Either way, they succeeded, and in 1909, the city granted what was known as revocable consent, which was basically a legal permit that allowed a private entity to occupy public subsurface spaces, though under strictly defined conditions. Although, to secure this permission, the Gimbels were obliged to these terms. Financial immunity for the public. The Gimbels Corporation agreed to pay 100% for construction, lighting, and maintenance costs in perpetuity, whereas there was also an annual franchise fee. That's right, the store paid a substantial yearly rent to the city treasury for the privilege of this encroachment. But it didn't end with that. There was also a public sidewalk clause, a key condition that ensured the tunnel remained a public easement, even though the Gimbels would have to manage it. So these are all essential points, and they come up in the story later in a major way. Basically, the tunnel owners were legally barred from restricting access to the general public during transit hours, though the Gimbels enjoyed great benefits. And in exchange for this massive investment, the Gimbels secured the exclusive right to also line the corridor of the tunnel with retail display windows, meaning this was essentially a block-long captive audience advertisement system that transformed a simple walkway into one of the world's longest store windows. So with the deal now in place, the brothers began to dig. The construction of Gimbel's new department store and its accompanying passageway was, in many ways, a logistical nightmare that defined 1909 for the company. While Burnham finalized the subdued Renaissance facade of white terracotta, engineers were carving out a 9-foot wide subterranean boulevard beneath 33rd Street. And although it wasn't New York's biggest tunnel, it also was not merely a hole in the ground. This was a high-stakes, high-pressure surgical procedure on the city's infrastructure, meaning to make it all possible, workers had to navigate a labyrinth of gas mains, high-voltage utility lines, as well as the actual massive foundation of the 6th Avenue elevated train. And they had to do this all without disturbing the traffic flow too much, as if they did, they'd take full liability for the mistakes. Even so, construction was a major success, and upon completion, the store itself was a marvel, boasting 45 massive display windows and 2,406 steel columns supporting 10 floors of retail theater, a shopping space made accessible not only by tunnel, but also by the copper-clad sky bridge over 32nd, which connected this new flagship to the Saks 34th Street building, which was also owned by the Gimbels. This air bridge allowed the company to unify its two massive city blocks into a single, seamless consumer environment that spanned from the sky to the subway beneath it. On opening day, September the 29th, 1910, public was awestruck. Thousands of New Yorkers flooded the city within a city, experiencing for the first time a climate-controlled refuge lined with polished brass, pristine tiling, and glowing showcase windows. Windows that featured the latest in Parisian fashion. The press hailed it as a triumph of efficiency, but the real magic, in many ways, was the tunnel, which, as I mentioned, allowed public station commuters to transition from rail to retail without ever stepping outside into the rain or the snow. For decades, the passage was a vital Midtown artery. Notable events such as the massive holiday rushes of the 1940s saw the tunnel at its peak. This corridor was a primary tactical tool in the Gimbels vs. Macy War, symbolizing the length at which companies were willing to go. The war was a brutal, multi-decade struggle for market dominance that defined American retail. While Macy's had the fame and their parade, Gimbels had geography. The tunnel allowed Gimbels to win that battle for foot traffic before consumers even reached the street level where Macy's stood. Hence, for a time, it seemed that Gimbels had successfully outmaneuvered its rival by weaponizing the very ground beneath Manhattan. However, that success would not last forever, as the first accurate omen of the tunnel's demise came as early as 1963 with the demolition of the original McKinn, Mead, and White designed Pennsylvania Station. This tragic loss was part of a broader mid-century movement known as urban renewal, a period defined by the aggressive razing of ornate, dignified landmarks in favor of stark, utilitarian structures. This so-called progress came at steep cost. Among the most painful losses were the Singer Tower of New York, once the world's tallest building, the Chicago Stock Exchange building, and the old Cincinnati Library, often cited as one of the most beautiful interiors in American history, and yet it was all sent to the dump. Cities were trading their dignity for corporate monstrosities, a trend that would ultimately doom Penn Station. So, as majestic granite columns were carted off to the garbage dump, the Gimbels family was facing their own challenges. Bernard Gimbel, the charismatic general of the Macy's War, passed away on September the 29th, 1966, exactly 56 years to the day after the flagship's opening. And in his passing, his son Bruce Gimbel took the reins and attempted to salvage the situation as best he could, given that the main source of foot traffic was about to be disturbed. And so Bruce began forecasting based on analytics available at the time. Though I need to emphasize here that they lacked the type of digital tools we have today. In fact, Gimbels used primitive resources that we now call prediction markets to look ahead. Basically, crude probabilities that could help forecast what impact things like current events might have on their business. And we might presume that one very important forecast was omitted as the 60s turned into the 70s. I'm talking about suburban flight and the rise of discount chains. And unfortunately, they just couldn't see it. Though, had this happened today with our new technological reality, the outcome might have been completely different. In fact, these days, people can use services to better predict a vast range of scenarios. One of those services comes in the form of an app, and it's called Callsheet. It also happens to be the sponsor of this episode. Let me explain. Callsheet is the largest prediction market in the United States, where users can put real money down on real-world events, elections, and more. It helps users understand the most likely real-world outcome on global events, competitions, and thousands of other scenarios. So just imagine how things would have turned out if the Gimbels had this app way back at the turn of the century. They would have definitely enjoyed the advantages of known probabilities provided by the service. So believe me, they would have certainly used it for trading, business outcomes, or even politics. So just imagine how we could benefit from prediction markets in our modern time. We can trade on crypto performance, employment rates, and stock performances on a regulated market. So download the Callsheet app using my link in the description and use promo code HISTORY when you sign up to get $20 when you trade $100. Again, use the link in the description and use code HISTORY to get started today. So even when they realized the severity of their situation, the Gimbels did not simply give up. Throughout the 1960s, the store fought to maintain its relevance, launched aggressive marketing campaigns, and attempted to modernize the retail floors. However, the status of the tunnel following the demolition of the original Penn Station was bleak. What was once a high-end promenade became a drafty, confusing shortcut through a construction zone, and later, a dingy basement hall that connected to the uninspired underground concourse of the new Penn Station. Moreover, the flow of well-to-do customers in the tunnel had now been replaced by a far more transient type of pedestrian. And here's where the paradox began. As you may recall, the store was still obliged to provide access as per their contract with the city. And so it didn't take long for this shift to begin a much darker chapter in the business's history. And to be fair, we should mention that this situation was not limited to just the little passage under Manhattan, as the downfall of the tunnel mirrored the greater fiscal crisis of New York City in the 1970s. You see, this was a time when the city was so broke that it was considering bankruptcy, meaning maintenance budgets for the subway system evaporated. And with no maintenance, the once bright-lit tiles of any passageway in New York became obscured by layers of soot and graffiti. As for the private tunnel, brass fixtures were stolen or tarnished, whereas the lighting became dim as light bulbs in need of replacement were simply flickering. And things got so bad that by the early 1980s, the tunnel had earned a new sinister nickname: the creepy corridor. And at this point, the very features that once made it a miracle of efficiency, its length, its isolation from the street, now made it a playground for crime. Crime which greatly affected the department store above, as the tunnel had become known to locals as the shoplifter's highway, a passage where thieves could grab merchandise and vanish underground before security could ever get them. Though things got even more out of hand, as individuals began seeking shelter from the elements in the tunnels. And in some cases, their activities were so concerning that I can't even really describe them here on YouTube, but I don't need to. I think you get the idea. In the meantime, publicly, the MTA was overwhelmed by a rising tide in felonies. And again, with almost no budget, they really couldn't afford to patrol the underground. And so both the city and the store owners knew that eventually something had to give. The final blow came in March of 1991, when a horrific assault occurred in the tunnel on a weekday afternoon. Again, I can't go into details on this one because it's heinous, but it crossed some major lines and became very controversial in the media, since the perpetrator facilitated the attack using construction equipment that had been left in the corridor to provide a kind of security screen. The public outcry was instantaneous and overwhelming. And here was the point where both the MTA and the private owners that had kept the tunnel open for decades out of obligation finally admitted that the space was unmanageable and unsafe. The authorities finally acted. Within weeks, the Gimbels Passageway was barricaded with heavy steel gates and cinder blocks. And just like that, the crown jewel of 1910 had become a tomb in the year of 1991. The closure of the tunnel was merely one of many symptoms of the dying giant above. Gimbels had already surrendered its flagship store in 1986 after the parent company decided to liquidate the entire division following years of stagnating sales. From there, the building was gutted and reborn as AS Plaza in 1989, later becoming the Manhattan Mall. However, even this retail evolution couldn't save the site. Hence, the mall's upper floors were converted to offices, and the retail anchors eventually failed altogether. By the year of 2021, the building stood largely empty of shoppers, though it did continue providing some office space in the floors above. And today, the tunnel is a kind of lost property. While the MTA manages the entry gates at 34th Street and Herald Square Station, physical maintenance still falls to new owners under that original revocable consent agreement. Though somewhat recently, there was an attempt to save it in the form of a $100 million restoration plan that suggested converting the corridor into a modern retail area. Though the deal hasn't come through, as the associated skyscraper project stalled when the anchor tenants backed out. And if you're wondering why it would cost $100 million, basically, the astronomical cost stems from the fact that they would need to rewire the entire block's utilities, install modern ventilation, and meet post-9/11 security and ADA standards. Though it could be worth it, as many have now dubbed this concept the Tunnel to New Jersey. A missing link of sorts, as reopening it would allow NJ Transit commuters to reach the 6th Avenue subway and PATH trains entirely underground, creating a seamless interstate transit spine. With that being said, what is left of the Gimbels Passageway survives as a potent icon of urban decay and mystery. For some, it's a gritty example of 1980s New York, whereas for others, like urban explorers, it's a type of liminal space that physically manifests the beautiful rot of old New York. And so, until further notice, the Gimbels Passageway remains a barricaded time capsule under New York. We'll leave it there for today, but I thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.